All right, welcome everybody. We are back at it. Can't believe another Monday is here. Gary, go ahead. All right. Do we get a double? All right, we'll wait as folks start to come in. Just based on, viewing of emails and stuff, I think we're going to have a pretty good turnout today. While we're just giving it a minute, Gary, I've got about 6 or 7 announcements I'd like to go over. Some of your favorite, part of the whole thing. But now, in all seriousness, I had just 2 quick things. On the 26th, there's 2 URLs there. First, Write a Boom early bird registration's open. I don't know why that came out first. It came out twice. Apologies. There's 2 URLs. Write a Boom early bird registration's out. Can't wait for Gary and Aaron Chernan's presentation on using automation as a sales wedge. We have split tracks this year. You can learn all about it for the first time. Hands-on technical for 2.5 days, and sales business go to market. Good afternoon, Bob. Good to see you. And the other thing is always, John Strand will be personally teaching SOC core skills starting on the 26th of this month. Always pay what you can. If you have a team of folks that are looking to get better at security, this is a must for your team. So those are the 2 quick announcements. Let's get on into it. All right. So it has been, a long time since we've had you on with us, Ryan. So welcome back. But I'm going to just really set the stage here because there's big news finally. I think, Ryan, we're in our 5th year. We've had you on probably 4 years ago, 3 years ago, and we've all been on this waiting for when is the real CMMC the rulemaking going to take effect, et cetera. And it certainly appears that we are right about here. There's just some final stages of some, as always, you have to allegedly, but we're at this point where, final comments are going to be made and I'm not going to steal your thunder, but it looks like we are very, very close. Welcome back, Ryan. For those that don't know you, I'll let you kick it off and share a little about yourself and what you do there at DevCert.
Yeah. So again, I been on the show before. Super excited to be back. For those of us who have not been on the same call at the same time, my team over at DevCert does compliance consulting. We've been doing these kinds of projects for years, since starting around 2016, 2017, working with like the NIST manufacturing extension partnership programs. And, obviously we noticed really early on that most defense contractors use MSPs. And there's a huge overlap there between, the ability for these contractors to make progress and needing their MSPs to help them make that progress. So it's a constant refrain for our team at DevCert. But yeah, we do a lot of work helping organizations figure out what controlled unclassified information is inside of their areas, and then work with MSPs to figure out how we're going to bring in security tools to meet requirements and kind of go through the process of getting someone to a point where they can then be assessed and certified. So it's a fun roller coaster to be on.
In the off chance that things don't go forward as planned, you're welcome back again next year when we reload.
Well, as I think we've learned, Gary, that everyone has to make an adjustment on how quickly stuff happens in government, right? Andrew, we were on these calls years ago going, oh, everybody, it's coming. Oh my gosh, are you reading this? And then we all had to sort of refresh ourselves on how long it takes for things like federal rulemaking to happen.
Look, in general, what I learned about government
we really are kind of at that point where now it's starting to rain outside and we're all trying to get a seat.
It takes a long time for them to turn anything on. Once they turn it on, they don't know how to turn it off.
That's really good.
No, there's no cancel button on this once it's live.
It's just interesting, Phyllis. I was going to say, hearing Ryan talk about, we realized, when working with all these manufacturers, we realized they all work with MSPs, and it's just interesting. It's like with the same narrative with MSISAC. It's it's cool to see NIST starting to recognize, as an example. CIS has recognized it for a long time, but it's cool to see NIST at least and CISA starting to show up at events.
Yes.
Like right a boom that they're starting to realize, wow, this, in terms of critical infrastructure, MSPs are heavily part of this equation. So,
yeah, we agree. I mean, we've been beating that drum for a while now that, that we have got to get better engaged. We, government and here in the US have to be better engaged with MSPs, because we can all acknowledge small mediums are the backbone of this country. But just like Ryan said, who is really supporting the IT infrastructure of those small mediums, right? And it's MSPs.
Yeah.
And so it's nice to finally see that engagement starting to happen. We need to be better though, but yes.
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to read something. It's a quote from Jacob Horn, Ryan, and this might going to be my first kind of unpack what he means here. And, so he says this in a podcast, as only Jacob can. He says 1,417 days after the original CMMC contract clause was created and 1,003 days after the announcement of CMC 2.0, here we are. The proposed rule revising DFARS clause 252.204-7021. This is the piece of the puzzle that will actually show up in your RFPs, contracts, awards, orders, etc. Can you unpack that for all of us lay people out here? I mean, I think we all know what he means, but kind of set the stage for us where we are here.
Yeah, without making any assumptions that everybody here knows CMMC or DFARS.
Yeah, yeah, and that's critical. So if we're thinking about what this arbitrary named clause coming out, why it matters so much, if you want to think about this from the perspective of this new regulation and this new certification standard that's come out, you've got really three federal rule sets that all work together, right? So the first one was the actual CUI program itself. That's the program that laid out the government's plans for identifying and disseminating and handling this new emergent category of information called controlled and classified information. Years later, in fact, at the beginning of the calendar year we're in right now, we got the second piece of the puzzle, which was a dedicated federal program for CMMC. That's the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. It's the DoD's sort of bespoke verification method for how you check whether people have been doing, as contractors, whether they've been meeting requirements that have been in their contracts for quite a few years now. So when you add those together, the final piece was the method by which the government imposes the need to become certified on contractors. The only way they can make you play by these rules is through contract clauses or by writing it into an agreement. If you're going to have that be standardized across all these DoD contracts, you got to use a clause, right? Because then the text is all the same from one contract to the next. So this new 48 CFR rule, as they call it, that has come out, includes all the right language of the contract clause. So that 7021 number, Andrew, that you just mentioned, is the number of the clause that will start to go into contracts probably either towards the end of this year or early next year. We're sort of in like a sliding scale window of how quickly that could roll out. But as soon as that becomes an option for government agencies, particularly the DoD components, to put into their possible RFQs or solicitations that as an MSP, your clients are going to be bidding on, that kicks off a whirlwind of activity. And it's mostly going to be centered around the customers that your clients have. So if you're an MSP, you've got a defense contractor client or clients. Some of them do work directly with agencies. That could be the case. Even more of your clients do work with prime contractors. These are private companies who themselves do the work with the government and then pass through to subcontractors. So one of the big X factors we got to be aware of here is as soon as it's possible to put this clause in contracts or in solicitations, the prime contractors aren't going to wait to find out which way the cookie crumbles, right? They're going to start demanding certifications from their subcontractors in preparation of them actually needing to have it on a future award. So you're going to have all of this downstream pressure. And if you've been paying attention to the actual CMMC program rule that was rolled out at the beginning of this year, it says that anybody who needs to be certified, before they can attempt for their certification, their external service provider also needs to be certified. So keep pushing out to the left in that timeline. Think about that for a minute. My primes need to be certified here. Their suppliers probably need to be certified in advance of that. And if they use an MSP, that MSP probably needs to be certified even sooner.
Right.
So
Ryan,
that's crazy.
Before I hand to Gary, because you were talking about this again, if MSPs, again, I'm not going to assume they know. They came out and said they need to be certified. Can you, again, just unpack what that means, what level, why, when, how? Because you're all of a sudden, you've been in this, like you said, for years. But now all of a sudden your phone's starting to ring more aggressively from MSPs. Unpack that last piece.
Wait, before you get to that, can I layer another question on top of this?
Did you say layer? He's not here.
So, Ryan, you help MSPs, right? Get certified? Ballpark, sure. In the last 12 months, how many have you helped?
Well, there's a lot of MSPs that we have in a holding pattern right now, because under the pilot programs that are available, only defense contractors can go through what's called the joint surveillance voluntary assessments. So if you're not a real deal contractor, MSPs are all kind of stuck in a holding pen, waiting for
in waiting until
they can. So they can prepare.
So what's that going to create in terms of a bottleneck and a timeline between that and when we start to see these clauses? Like you said, they're two to the left.
Yeah, if you talk to a lot of they're called C3PAOs, the certified third-party assessing organizations who can get you your certification, the white hot center of all of the leads that they're working on and all of the assessments they're scheduling are MSPs who are like, wow, we have to get on board with this sooner rather than later. I'd say that they're seeing just as much demand from MSPs as they are from defense contractors because of this dawning realization. So we've definitely seen MSPs wake up. It's not nearly enough.
Well, what do you think that what do you think that funnel looks like of how many MSPs would need to be certified, and what the universe of would you say C3PO?
C3PAOs, yeah. Yeah, we're kind of like uncovering this hidden demand chain or supply chain for like, okay, where's the bottleneck going to be, to your point? And it's definitely going to be C3PAO's scheduling and availability, because there's only so many of those organizations doing a healthy number of assessments.
But I was going to say there is this notion of self-assessment or self-attestation, which was a big push because of that exact reason, which is, one of the big pushes for CMMC 2.0 is that you just can't scale. Mm-hmm. When you look at a big government contractor, I don't want to name any names, but like, let's say you're going to build an aircraft carrier or a plane. Those organizations have thousands and thousands and thousands of subs. Okay. Right. And so there will never be enough, auditors in order to do those assessments. So really, in acknowledgement of, hey, this doesn't scale, they did come up with the self-assessment or self-attestation.
But is it, Ryan, isn't there a window of that time will eventually subside of the self-assessment from what I understood, or is that?
Yeah, they're trying to sort of, build some sort of cushion here. But if you look at like the newly released contract clause, they only estimate that like 2% of companies will qualify for self-assessment as specified by the contracts officer. And they anticipate that the rest will all need either a level 1 self-assessment, which is this is not the kind of contractors you're working with. If you're an MSP and your client cares about CMMC, they're a level 2 target organization, right? So for those individuals, the vast majority are expected to get an actual certification. So again, this is the DoD doesn't know how many subcontracts are going to be issued when they give out even a single contract. So you're seeing the DoD say like, hey, for that first year, we're going to try and roll this out for like around 500 contracts or something, some small number. But Phyllis, to your point, how many subcontracts are behind that contract award? It's a massive,
at least
multiplier.
tens of thousands, if not, like in the six figures.
Yeah. So the release valve that's built in, to your point, Andrew, is in the contract clause language and in the provision language that go out in the RFPs and in the bid opportunities. The contracts officers are going to say, I'm willing to accept a certificate or a self-assessment on this particular award. And then it's kind of Mad Libs, right? There's just a blank spot where they can drop that in, and then they can adjust that later. So there will probably be inside baseball where DoD acquisition and sustainment will kind of decide who's allowed to include self-assessment as one of the options. We don't know what that'll look like, but the primes aren't going to wait to find out which way that gets written.
Let's just do a hypothetical. Self-assessor. I'm an MSP, or I'm even a manufacturing company. I'm self-assessed. I'm in. Compromise of CUI. Do you see some type of threat actor gets in, compromises? Oh, it was this person was this company said they were self-assessed. They weren't. What kind of kickback? What do you think once those incidents start to occur? What happens there? Is there going to be, hey, enough of those, and it's just like no more Could we see that?
We certainly could. These regulators do have political pressure from the outside, right? The whole reason that NIST 800 and 171, the document with all the requirements you have to meet, was issued like way, way, way before the contract clause and all of these other verification steps rolled out, was because of pressure from a major agency hack. And so you've seen things get fast forwarded very quickly when there's a headline making event. So there's always the possibility that timelines could move up, or that the option for self-assessment
the same
could be
thing
taken off the table.
Can happen with people that were certified.
No doubt.
Whether they're self-assessed or certified, almost like either way, you can run into the same issue. It's going to happen, right? We're in an assume breach world.
No question. I was just wondering, could there be this, all of a sudden there's this one, and it's like, no more. That's true.
Yeah, be aware that there's already a reporting chain for incidents built into the current contract clauses that these contractors have. So if you think about the narrative here, you have a breach, happens, right? Hey, that's assumed, to your point, Gary. You report it. That reporting chain goes back up to the contracts officer, 2 layers up from where you are, because it moves up the chain till it hits the contracts officer. That contracts officer could then go look in the supplier performance risk system where you record your self-assessed scores and go, self-assessed? Hey, let me get on the phone with the Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Assessment Center, DIBCAC, which is run by DCMA. That's the Defense Contract Management Agency. I'd like to order a high confidence audit, like you don't have a choice, prepare to be boarded. And then DIBCAC can come out and do an assessment which matches the same assessment criteria and style as what you might see in a certificate style C3PAO assessment. If they don't like what they see, they can recommend next actions, either up to the contracts officer or over to the Department of Justice for False Claims Act. So the process flow exists. Let's just put it that way. There's some very real risks here to self-assessing and outkicking your coverage.
That would never happen, though.
Yeah, that's not the default norm for what we're dealing with today, spread across the defense industrial base.
All right, Gary, over to you.
Yeah. So having said all this, if you had to guess, when do you think realistic timeline, when this starts to show up in contracts?
We will definitely see it in contracts by late spring of next year. What I think is interesting is that this revised clause has only got a 60-day comment period. Everything's due by October 15th. And then at that point, this is not a complicated clause. It's a few paragraphs. So by and large, the DoD will probably just get to ignore most of the comments they receive, and they could flip this around in time for the election. So we're in a sliding scale, call it 6-month window, where it could go live at any time. But here's the thing: as soon as that comment period closes, and as soon as the final language of the clause is released in a final form, that's when the prime contractors begin their supply chain risk management efforts. I'm not worried about it showing up directly in my contract. I'm worried about the town halls, the supplier meetings, hey, as of today, you're off our vendor list unless XYZ happens.
Which interesting, Gary, I was talking to earlier today to an MSP, decent sized MSP that does a lot in this space. And we're just saying, what's it like? And they said, it was really quiet for a while. And all of a sudden, these manufacturers are reaching out. All of a sudden, it's this realness all of a sudden again, are calling up, hey, we need to engage finally. We've been putting this off. And I think, Ryan, that's your point, is that they're not going to wait for this to show up in contract clauses.
No, they're just not. And that's the same thing happened a few years ago when the requirement to upload a self-assessment score came out in contract clause form. If you're tracking all the weird numbers here, it was the 70-19 and the 70-20 clause, like numerically right before the one we're talking about today. The day that clause came out in final form, the primes began banging the drum and basically shouting at all of their suppliers, like, you need to have that score uploaded. And that was well before the clause wasn't even allowed to be in contract.
So just drill down a little deeper. So it sounds like this is getting real soon for MSPs. Like this is in the next months, talking about months now. How does 7021 fit into the broader CMMC framework?
Sure. So this clause, the 7021 clause, is what makes CMMC and the need to be certified, or at least self-assessed, completely real for a defense contractor. And because this clause is in dialogue with the CMMC program, all of the Federal Register publications all keep pointing you back over to that document as well, and that rule as well. You have to remember that a lot of the rules for what has to be ready and in place and accessible and all of that stuff is over in the CMMC program. That is where the federal rule says if a contractor is entrusting any security protection data, which they say is just configuration data about a contractor system, and they're entrusting that to an external service provider, that service provider is now hosting that data. They have it in their IT glue instance. They have it in their RMM tool. They have it in their EDR stack. They are now an external service provider. They must have a matching certification for their client. So if your defense contractors all need level 2, the MSP needs a level 2 certification as well. If even one of your customers needs a level 3 certification, you need a level 3 certification. So there's a direct linkage to what you're going to need to have as an MSP, and it needs to match what is being specified for your clients. So if you think about that, I can get a swing and a miss on self-assessment right up until the moment I have even one client who was told it needs to be a certificate.
Yeah.
And then it's game over for you as an MSP.
We're talking a lot about some of the bad news here and prep and timelines, but I'm wondering, you've been doing this a while. Is there some good news that MSPs are much better prepared? They've been working on frameworks and security postures for an additional 3 years. We know what it was like 3 years ago. The gap was wide. Do you think now the gap of what they need to do, just based on their, poverty level of security, hygiene, is make this a little easier?
Yeah. And, Phyllis, we were talking about this before the call kicked off. If you have an MSP who's already been working inside of another framework like CIS, if you've been working on things like that, there are necessary improvements to your operational maturity as an MSP, that translates really well into these other requirements. Now, don't get me wrong, these are government requirements. There are requirements that stick out like a sore thumb, that make no sense, that no company, private company in their right mind would ever try to do, if not,
Well, they don't make sense to you,
handed
but the
down from on
government is
high
much smarter than
federally.
you.
Sure. They speak in their own dialect. They use their own words for things. NIST doesn't want to accidentally recommend a product, so they come up with fake names for things that don't sound like Active Directory or don't sound like EDR, so that they can be completely neutral, and that does not help. Let's just call it for what it is. So there is a translation layer that's needed to take existing frameworks you've already been performing against and kind of drop them in. Phyllis, CIS has already done a good job of mapping, CIS into things like 800.171, so you can get up to speed quicker.
Speaking of which,
for sure.
Phyllis, has Controls Navigator been updated for 8.1 and all those things? Or
Yep, the Navigator's been updated for 8.1, as well as, as soon as CMMC came out, we mapped to CMMC 1.0. There was not a big difference between 1.0 and 2.0, but you'll find that mapping on the Navigator. And we were talking before, for the self-attestation or self-assessment, we map to like 70% of it. The part that we don't map to really is the physical security. And then L2, we map to around 66, like 66% of L2. And again, there are physical requirements that CMMC is going to require you, like, badge requirements, escorting visitors, and a lot of physical controls that CIS controls are not necessarily going to have. And, it's just very interesting when you think about these physical controls with remote work, and just, also, does your MSP have those physical controls in place? Because most MSPs really do not. Those are really very government things to badge in and to badge out and to escort people and all those kinds of things. So I'm curious, I don't know if Ryan, like what happens to those physical requirements? It just kind of is like hitting me now when, a lot, those are really like SCIF kind of requirements. So I'm just kind of curious, like what is it that the government is expecting?
Yeah, that's a great talking point. We could almost do like a half-day seminar on how you take these requirements and turning those into something that you can actually live by, right? Because at face value, they seem very difficult to meet if you're an MSP tech. At the end of the day, there are ways that a remotely working MSP technician, even someone working from home or in different situations, can still maintain the federal definition of what's called the controlled environment. You're going to have to do more work to avoid shoulder surfing, understanding who's around and behind you, knowing when a sensitive conversation needs to happen in a closed room, things like that. But it is.
I recently purchased a cone of silence.
I mean, where is it? Where is it, Gary? I feel like Gary stopped on the side of the road, took an orange cone.
Yeah, you might have MSP techs might need to be able to build their operation security pillow fort. They might need to do something, but there's ways through this. It just takes a little bit of creativity, but then still, being honest about how to meet requirements in a way that isn't misrepresentative or, not trying to skirt around things or stuff like that. I saw a great question in chat.
There's been some great stuff in there, by the way.
Yeah. So someone made a statement. Hey, the easy answer as an MSP: ignore federal contractors. Like, don't work with them.
Well, you said last time when you were here, Ryan, that we're reaching a point where you either had to move away or you had to lean in and get this, which still kind of makes sense, except I know MSPs that aren't prepared, who have one or two big customers that they can't afford to lose, and they almost can't afford to finish, like put you in a tough spot if you're one of those. And that's not uncommon.
Absolutely. I mean, MSPs have been told for years, you need to diversify your client portfolio. Don't be one dimensional. And now we're in the situation where one of those dimensions, part of your client portfolio now has new rules that probably dictate how the entire organization has to live. So what do you do when there's that tipping of the scales? And so we like to use some language on our team, which is, easy decision, hard life, hard decision, easy life. Like if the easy decision right now is just don't do work with contractors, and that might work for the next 18 months, but you got to remember the federal CUI rule is coming out. What happens when every healthcare organization technically handles CUI? Because that's what PHI is. What happens when every public university is handling CUI? Because that's what student aid and FAFSA applications are. These things are all in the CUI registry. So many industries are going to be affected by this if they accept any federal dollars, any subsidies, any grants, because this starts to flow into all contracts and agreements with the federal government. So yeah, you can get away from DoD, but you might not outrun the blast wave as this spreads into more and more privatized industries.
Yeah, Ryan, Scott Edwards was talking about this when they first came out with that nonprofit that, but can you just unpack that a little bit, that this might be the North Star, right, for other areas that government might look to? Is that really what we're saying here?
Oh, yeah. The other federal agencies are all looking at the DoD's effort here with CMMC as sort of the canary in the coal mine. How is this going to work for them? What lessons can we learn before at our own agency level we roll things out? Most other agencies don't use these DFARS clauses. The D is defense. They're using other contract clauses that don't exist yet, or they're using their own bespoke clauses in their own little acquisition areas. So they're all kind of waiting and saying, oh, okay, that's a mistake we can learn from, or, oh, that's a success we can duplicate when we do it on our side of the fence.
Right. And remember, CMMC came about because DoD felt like organizations really weren't meeting the 800-171. And 171 is kind of for everybody, right? I mean, it's not unique to any one kind of vertical. And so, when it first came out, it was just like, well, this is just 171 rebranded. But really, if you look behind it, it's because the government or DoD felt like organizations weren't following it well enough. And so then they were having all these issues and all these breaches, right? And so what you see is you do see a lot of federal organizations still getting breached, right? And so, I think what Ryan is saying is true. I'm just kind of backing it up, that if you look back to the original intent, it really was to get suppliers to kind of up their game when it comes to cybersecurity. And so as more and more breaches occur, and as you see this ripple effect of ransomware and everything across the different verticals, K-12, SLTT, manufacturing, you name it, something is going to happen, right? And so we should all just be prepared as MSPs, or you should all.
Way easier, I feel like, if we could just get rid of all digital currency and shut down the internet.
There you go.
I mean, no more issues.
So by the way, there were a lot of questions in there, Ryan, about a self-assessment, which level. If in listening to Ryan, a lot of those questions I think were answered. If you don't feel yours was, just restate it, and we'll ask Ryan if ideally we have time. But there was questions. I'm not sure if there's a C3PAO or us. There was a question, just joking with Robert, on who is the most affordable C3PAO, or are there reasonably priced ways to do this, Ryan? Was one of the questions.
Yeah, one of the things that we see as an opportunity to keep costs as manageable as possible would be to, if you've got a client who absolutely needs to be certified, get on a schedule with that client, those clients, and yourself, the MSP, and solve some of the same problems at the same time. It's going to require some vulnerability and some transparency. But if you can do duplicate work at the same time and deduplicate that effort, those labor costs, maybe even, do some beta program style discounts for that client, then you can cross the finish line at the same time. And we've spoken with a few different C3PAOs who are at the very least open to the idea of co-certifying an MSP with their contractor client, to where you do one assessment and issue 2 certificates. So that's a potential option as well, but you're going to have to be very head on a swivel, prepared for that. I think a lot of MSPs maybe don't always understand what goes into having a successful assessment. It's very documentation heavy. Every piece of visual evidence you can have before the assessment starts, it's probably a 3 or 4x reduction in the amount of time that the assessment takes. And it's obviously very predictable outcomes. So we've been part of joint surveillance assessments that were scheduled for 7 to 10 days and wrapped up in 2 because everything was documented.
You know what I was thinking about this, like from a commercial aspect, and Phyllis, I know I keep asking one more question before we get to your questions, but there's a cost to all this, right? Not just dealing with third party, but like just the governance and compliance internally, right? The discipline tools. And if you have 2 customers out of 50 that this applies to, or 50 out of 50, it doesn't make a difference. Like somehow for your non-regulated customers, you're going to have to explain the value of heightened security because you have to be able to commercialize this across your base. You're not going to be able to take on extra cost of your security posture and only get 2 customers to pay for it. Like it doesn't work that way in an MSP. Does that make sense?
Makes a lot of sense, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have to look at the addressable market and what you think your MSP is going to look like 2 years from now, 3 years from now. If you're one of the first, I don't even know, 100 MSPs who are certified, you're a unicorn. Let's be honest. And so when another MSP decides I've only got 2 clients and I can't justify organizational transformation to serve those 2 clients, they're going to have to go somewhere else.
I was just going to ask you, Ryan, not to use please everybody out. Don't take it as a scare tactic, but have you seen share shifting where someone's like, hey, they're just not ready. Sorry, I gotta.
Oh yeah. I mean, we have seen defense contractors downgrade the kind of relationship that they have with an MSP, saying like, you're sure as heck not our MSSP anymore. That's too high risk based on the outcomes we need. Why don't you just fix our printers? That like sort of downgrading them into a much reduced role. We've also seen like total loss of the client. Hey, this just isn't for us. We're not going to renew the contract. The MSP will let them out of their contract. Whatever it ends up being, we're definitely seeing, the cookie crumble in different ways. That's going to result in either a new service provider added over the top of an existing MSP or completely displacing that MSP.
We're going to come back to Gary assessing. I'm going to ask you a question at the end about, how do you assess this as the MSP themselves? So Phyllis, over to you on some questions.
Yeah, sure. So how will contractors prepare for the compliance requirements detailed in DFARS 252, 204, 702?
Yeah. So when we get into how contractors are going to get ready, you have to remember that contractors are usually doing like double or triple translation of these requirements. Like contract clauses are already hard enough to read and interpret. Now you're being put in front of this NIST special publication, which itself isn't using industry standard language to describe how to do cybersecurity. And then you're having to go to your MSP or your internal IT team and say, guys, what is this? And then they come back with words that are also like maybe more familiar, but definitely not your area of subject matter expertise. So anytime you've got an MSP who can sift through the first few layers of translation, MSPs don't have to be contracts experts, but they can read 800-171 and say, it's describing an EDR, or that needs to be a policy, or this is HR's problem. I mean, that is a massive jump forward in preparation and readiness. So those are things that we should really, try to better understand and get out ahead of. But as far as like the contractors being able to be prepared, I think one of the biggest things that MSPs aren't doing today that would help a ton is putting themselves in the shoes of their client and saying, all right, it says right here that the contractor has to define X number of unsuccessful logon attempts before lockout, and flipping the map on that and saying, hey, as an MSP, I used to sit back and let my client tell me what they wanted that to be, because that was a low risk position to put myself in. I put my neck out too many times. I've gotten burned too many times by having an opinion. This time, I'm actually going to impose a standard on my clients, because there's zero chance I can afford to manage all my clients differently when it's so high stakes like this. I got to draw a line in the sand and say, here is our standard as the MSP. I'm going to define it for you. Speak now or forever hold your peace. Most of the defense contractors that MSPs work with don't have a strong opinion on that topic. So do them that favor, be clear, help them make that decision in advance, make it for them, and you're actually going to cover ground a lot faster. That can really help preparation and readiness.
Symmetry is an MSP's best friend.
And I have to say, this is what Gary says all the time, is that, and this is the hard, my observation, this is a hard thing for MSPs to do, is say, this is my bottom line. I'm only willing to service customers that are willing to go with us on this cybersecurity journey, right? Where, a lot of MSPs still are saying, oh, how do I get my customers to pay for security, right? And so I think it's just kind of everything that we've been saying on this call in particular, but just from week to week is, the MSP community cannot afford to not have cybersecurity as part of their offering. Number one, even just to protect themselves. And then of course now, you've got this forcing function to help protect their clients. And so, like we said, the CMMC is just the 171, right? And so it's something that every organization is probably going to be responsible for eventually. And so, implementing it now, I think is really just beneficial to your MSP as well as your end customers. Because like I said, not to tout controls, but controls are pretty basic. And like we map a lot to the technical controls in 171, and of course then the CMMC. Again, it's just that physical security and those environmental things that we don't cover. I think you talked about maybe you did cover some of this, but does anything else come to mind as far as common challenges and pitfalls that organizations may face when trying to comply with this latest DFARS rule or clause?
Yeah, one of the ones we've already pointed out is the fact that your external service providers now need to also be certified. Like that's a major, card that was dealt to us with the latest rulemaking round. That, wow, that's expansive. So that's definitely a pitfall. We still have a lot of defense contractors who are working under old rules, right? They could use whatever MSP they wanted last year, and they're still moving forward with an MSP who themselves might not be aware that they have to be certified at this point. So like closing that knowledge gap is definitely a major pitfall that we have to close. Some of the other big pitfalls that we run into is just like tools compatibility. It's great that you've found a follow the sun model for like your XDR solution as an MSP, right? That's 24/7 coverage. That's great. But some of these contractors are handling export controlled information, ITAR, technical data, things like that. Can a foreign national jump in and fix a problem in that system? Maybe not. So there are some hidden incompatibilities, I think, that need to get resolved. MSPs want to build their tech stack on a fully compliant stack. And that's also going to be a major factor in whether they want to pursue this, right? Tool change is a major transition cost. So those are some of the things that are definitely pitfalls that like are shared overlaps between MSPs and these contractors.
Yeah, it's interesting, Gary. I'm glad you brought that
think
up.
about large MSPs that are doing acquisitions that do a lot of this, and they can't immediately get people onto their one tool stack. Do you know what I mean? Like all that takes time. Almost everyone at that level has some degree of offshoring. There's so much to this at all scale levels.
Yeah. I was going to say, Gary, this adds a whole
Yeah.
nother layer of complexity, what Ryan just brought up, especially for the platform players that are, it's interesting, Phyllis, because we've been starting to now incorporate 8.1 in governance. And Gary, what we didn't used to have to think about in due diligence of acquiring another MSP. If I am in the DIB, now I've got this whole other set of requirements when I'm going through due diligence. Fair?
Yeah, but it's so, I mean, it makes it, dude, as someone who is in those conversations buying MSPs, it is already so hard to find a good MSP without a lot of hair on it. Layering in more at this point is this is very complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Gary, to that point, I mean, we talk a lot about technical debt, right? Old legacy systems you want to replace so they could be more secure. I think MSPs also need to think about organizational debt, right? It might be easier to actually start a brand new effort, a brand new offering, staff it with just a few people, and start to build, compliant best practices with a greenfield tool set than to try and retrofit everything.
If you do an acquisition, you move those customers into the entity. That's really good point.
Yeah, absolutely. When you look at like a potential M&A strategy, you're probably going to want to just move DIB clients from these various organizations over into a new unit so that it's all consistent and consolidated.
Yeah, that's really interesting. If they have enough of them, right, Ryan, it probably makes sense to open up a unit, just a division, new Fed.
You're assuming MSPs know.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like that isn't, I mean, you're smiling, but like I really shouldn't make that assumption.
Wow. Okay.
Because there might not have been, like you said, if they're a layer removed, there might not have been up until now a reason for them. And maybe they have account managers who aren't really VCIOs, and they have not asked those questions until they get asked. They may find out by being asked by their customer, and then it's too late.
So, Gary, are you saying that there might be MSPs who don't know if their customer is like a DoD subcontractor or
yes, that is what I'm saying. That is
all the time. And the reason for that is because of how the client bills themselves, right? Like you're talking to a client as an MSP and they're like, oh, we're a professional services firm, or, hey, we're an automotive OEM. They don't talk about,
I mean,
that
there
20%.
There are a whole bunch of other DIB requirements outside of CMMC that MSPs may be unaware of, like the reporting requirements and all of that for breaches and stuff. So interesting.
Which just real quick, anecdotally, sure. Ryan, I remember I don't know if it was you or there's a story about I think it was you. We were talking about this company that did kitchen type work and refrigerator. Wasn't that you? Like that?
Yeah. There's an organization that near and dear to my heart. They sell stoves and refrigerators, right? Commercial kitchen equipment, right? The most straightforward commercial off the shelf thing you can imagine. But when an agency buyer wants you to sell that equipment at a military installation, you might have to look at some information that is more sensitive than just the specs on a piece of kitchen equipment to do it. And so it's not what you make, right? You might describe yourself as an automotive supplier or this, that, or the other. Right. And that's not wrong. But sometimes the data you have to consume in order to place your commercial product or your commercial service into a government contract is more sensitive than the actual.
You were saying like the facilities themselves, they'd have to see the facility and how it was configured and all. And these were government, military bases. And it's really fascinating, Ryan, how you're like, but it's just refrigerators and stoves. And
you're right. I mean, I could see that.
Yeah, things like that happen all the time. And if, as an MSP, you can't always get to the bottom of that just by looking at their website or, things like that. You got to be proactive.
I mean, you could say, I just make plane parts, right? But no one knows that the plane part is really for I always pick on Joint Strike Fighter because I worked on that when I was at the agency, but yeah. So yeah, I can see that. So, before I hand it back over to to Gary, again, let's be a little more positive. Like what does good look like for MSPs as they're helping their clients along to comply with this? Like, what is it that, MSPs can do? Let's give them a little pep talk.
I think there's a fantastic opportunity inside of this whole challenge, which is, if we're all being honest here, these requirements are not normal, right? What other framework or set of requirements demands that the MSP has complete parity with the organization who's actually being regulated? That's wild. And also, there's requirements in the model that are not standard issue requirements. They're not in the CIS, CSC or anything like that, because they're not maybe the best way to pay down risk. So let's all be honest. Go to your clients and say, we're going to have to do some things to comply with these requirements. Clear the air. Let them know that these aren't just things that are invisibly happening at no cost and will incur no new charges. And don't live in the ambiguity. Create some clarity around that and say, like, we're 60% of the way there. We're 80% of the way there. It's going to take some work for us to get up to this point. And I think that if you can do that, you can actually arrive at net new revenue earlier, because you're going to force that discussion on, this is a project, this will cost more. I think we all knew that was coming, but let's go ahead and say the quiet part out loud. And I think that will engender some good transparency between the client and an MSP, and really start to build a way more collaborative
It's a really good point, Ryan. And as we hand it to Garrett for a question or two to you, don't forget about your MSAs, because this will drastically, or could drastically, change what you're and what they're responsible for. We're going to be talking a little bit more about shared responsibility in upcoming CyberCalls, but yeah, don't leave that alone either, right, Ryan? Because there could be these requirements that you never used to take care of, and then now you are taking care of, but they're not in your MSA. And if they're not in MSA, then you're not having indemnification, and we could go on and on and on from there. So, Garrett, over to you.
So can you tell us about enforcement and consequences? Like, give us an idea what that could look like. We're talking a lot about what has to happen, but let's just say we're on the other side of this now. What does that look like?
Sure. Yeah, and again, you have to think about that. Everything I'm about to say is something that could happen. We're not saying it's the norm. We're not saying that there's a freight train headed your way, but these are very real enforcement mechanisms that exist. Again, we talked earlier about something called FCA. I don't know if I spelled that out, but that's the False Claims Act. If you're a contractor and you say that you complied with these rules that have been in place since 2017 and you're not, that is a false claim used to influence federal dollars and spending. The damages for that can be up to 3 times the amount of the contracts you lied on. So it's this false claims prosecutions are, I think at this point, the second biggest source of revenue for the federal government next to taxes. So just to give you a sense of scale here, there's a very real outcome for some contractors who are misrepresenting their compliance, that they, without even knowing it right this moment, have been named in a sealed complaint that will surface at some point in the future. And the person who acted as the whistleblower gets 20%.
So that would be bad.
So that would be bad. There's other things that can happen in and around that as well. But just know that, like, there's very real consequences and things that can happen as a result of this. Just mishandling and failing to protect export controlled information has up to a 20-year prison sentence attached to it. I mean, that's very high impact for the people that are involved. And so that's all stuff that should motivate an MSP to say, like,
and the clients, right? How many clients have attested about 800-171, Ryan? I think we're going to find that out, aren't we?
Yeah, the language that goes out in RFPs that says, by submitting a bid, you, the offerer, attest that you have implemented and will implement NIST 800-171. But you're making a claim every time you respond to a bid.
Interesting. Yeah, where are we? You got
You.
me? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, okay, good. Because we got about 5 minutes left here. If you have questions and we have time, send them on in. But Gary, I want you to look through the lens of, again, you're in front of Troop here, 650 MSPs. One of the questions is, hey, I got a few how do you advise an MSP? Gary, I have a few clients. I have 8 clients. What percent of revenue should I get rid of these clients and focus on, things that I'm really not, I'm not up to speed here in terms of being ready for this. What kind of advice, or what does that conversation look like?
So I would probably zoom out and say, before we even get to that, if we have not gotten to the point where we are at least IG1 for every customer, if we're not doing BIAs for every customer, we have an issue. So that has to be I used the word earlier, poverty level. Our poverty level around these things, that's the level. That's the poverty level now. And if we're not, you got an issue on your hand with what you're asking me.
Right, okay? Right.
Because you're a long way from home. Then if I didn't know everything about what we talked about on the show today, I would find someone like Ryan, and I would have a conversation to really put my arms around about what my gaps are, time, money, maturity, to see, where I am. Then I would look at my customer base and I would make sure I knew my base. In other words, not just what I knew about, but I would want to know what I didn't know about to know what my exposure is, on this. I would start doing that tomorrow morning. Okay. Because you could run out of time, and it's not easy for MSPs to replace bad customers they want to get rid of, let alone having to replace good customers that maybe they'd be forced to get rid of. And at that point, I think you're ready to make a plan and make those decisions, Andrew.
Yeah.
But I would do all that preliminary work starting again tomorrow morning. I would start to do that. And by the way, all of that is good work.
Right. It's
right. Knowing more about your customers, making sure you're at a minimum level of posture with everyone, whatever it takes, including changing your commercial relationship, right? And then taking it a step further and really being educated on what's involved and is it doable to you? And you're going to have a decision to make at some point. One, or the worst thing is if the decision gets made for you and you get a call from a customer in 6 months and it's too late. And then you realize there's a second customer that you didn't even talk to about it. It doesn't take many customers for an MSP who's running at 15 or 12% to be in dire straits.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting, aside from the great advice you just gave, Gary, what Ryan said earlier, which is don't assume that just because your customer does X, that they are not working in the DIB. Get inquisitive, and obviously, Gary, your point about BIAs, right? If we understood how they make money, what their critical clients are, critical systems, processes, etc., when we were doing that, we'd find that out, wouldn't we?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you mentioned this. Someone else here asked about physically setting up a different entity to do this. Because you mentioned it, but you have to be at scale. To be able to do that and have it make financial sense, you have to be at scale. If you're not, it's just not an option for the average MSP who's under 10 million.
Got it.
That being said, Gary, I mean, just the opportunity that you could scale as a result of doing CMMC right is kind of wild. I mean, when you think about that, and this is a conversation we get into all the time with MSPs. You're going to have to spend X probably to be able to build this offering. And then you could charge more, and there's probably an ROI there. And they'll say, okay, well, that's an investment. But then I always ask them, well, what were you going to do for the next 3 years to scale and grow? Because that would have cost something too. So,
I agree. And what I have seen, because I work with some MSPs who are far down the line, not only by growing that base, but their security posture has gotten to the point where they command a higher price from their entire customer base. So not only are they getting some new customers, and they're very protected customers because they don't have a lot of other places they can go, but they're adding more non-government business and be able to command a higher price just because they have a higher level of discipline and posture than the average MSP. Like, it's good business. Whether you're going to handle these customers or not, we've been saying that all the things we talk about every week here are good business.
Yep. Good stuff.
You should have a different kind of customer when this is all said and done.
Yep.
Either it's new customers or your customers have become different as a result of going through this with you.
Yeah.
Right.
You're a different MSP too. So,
Yeah.
hey, Ryan, awesome having you back.
Yeah, great job, Ryan.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
My
fantastic.
pleasure.
Phyllis, Gary, wonderful seeing you as always. Everybody out there, thanks for joining in.